Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the organizing committee, I am deeply honored and privileged to extend a warm welcome to all of you to the inaugural session of the first international conference on decolonizing English, ICDE 2025, organized by the Department of English Language Teaching of University of Jaffna in collaboration with our proud Ivanpu awardee, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, the patron of this conference. Our conference theme, Decolonizing English, carries a profound significance. We gather here in a once colonized land to engage in dialogues in English, and we do so with our keynote speakers from all the way from New Zealand and the United Kingdom, our colonizers. This intersection of histories and perspectives is not only symbolic, but also essential to the spirit of our conference. Over these 3 days, we will immerse ourselves in thought-provoking keynote and plenary addresses, engaging technical sessions, a special spotlight session, and dynamic panel discussion, all navigating through 5 different themes. Let us keep our minds open, ready to listen, reflect, question, and respond. With that introduction, let us begin our inaugural session with the lighting of traditional oil lamp. In Eastern tradition, the auspicious occasions begin with light, a symbol of wisdom, hope, and new beginnings. May I now have the honor of inviting the following dignitaries to step forward and light the traditional oil lamp. Professor S. Sri Satkunaraja, the Vice Chancellor and the Conference Chair. Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, one of the plenary speakers and the patron of this conference. Professor S. Raghuram, Co-Chair and Dean, Faculty of Arts. Dr. K. Shanmuganathan, Head, Department of English Language Teaching. Professor K. Sri Ganeshan, Convener, ICDE 2025. Professor Stephen May, Keynote Speaker, ICDE 2025. Professor Dushanti Mendis, Plenary Speaker, Day 2. Professor Gu Mingyu Michel, Plenary Speaker, Day 3. Professor N. Shanmugalingam, former Vice Chancellor, University of Jaffna. Emeritus Professor A. Shanmugadas, former Dean, Faculty of Arts. Dr. Karunagaran, the Editor, ICDE 2025. Ms. Aarti Hensman, the Secretary, ICDE 2025. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, may I now request you to remain standing for a minute of silent prayer. Thank you. Please be seated. With the light now kindled and our hearts stilled in reflection, it's my pleasure to welcome you with a vibrant traditional Tamil dance performance presented on this stage to mark the auspicious beginning of our conference. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am here to thank the performers of the welcome performance attached to the Department of Drama and Theatre Arts.
Bow down and listen.
Yeah, I'm going to say. Actually, the performance began with Tottu Kumbudu, a respectful salutation honoring parents, teachers, the sacrifices of our ancestors and artists. It is choreographed using a repeating 1-2-3 beat pattern inspired by elements from Tamil cultural performance traditions to unite people through rhythm and movement. Decolonizing performance reconnects us to our roots, celebrate identity and uniqueness, and embraces freedom. Their theme was also symbolizing our theme, decolonizing performance. And we are grateful for the Department of Drama and Theatre Arts, Sir Ponnambalam Ramanathan, Faculty of Visual and Performing Arts. The performance was choreographed and directed by Dr. K. Navadashini, and the assistants were N. Jalini. The drum was performed by Mr. M. Kediswaran, and the other musical instruments were played by Mr. T. Justin Jelud, Mr. Usander, and the production management was by Mr. J.M.K. Nicholas and A. Prashant, and overall in charge of the performance was Miss R. Tavachelvi. And I'm here to name the performers also. They were Jansika, Sulakshana, Suganya, Ajanda, Aruni, Sudarshini, Viduna, and Jalini. Once again, a huge thanks to all the performers. Now, while the stage is being prepared, may I kindly request the distinguished guests to come onto the stage. The conference chair, Professor S. Sri Sadkunaraja, the co-chairs, Professor S. Raghuram and Dr. K. Shanmuganathan, the convener of the conference, Professor K. Sri Ganeshan, the keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Stephen May, University of Auckland, New Zealand, the plenary speakers of the conference, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, Pennsylvania State University, USA, Professor Dushyandi Mendis, University of Colombo, Sri Lanka, Professor G.U. Mingyu Michel, Education University of Hong Kong, and Professor Alicia Kogo from University of London, UK. She will be joining us soon. The Secretary of the Conference, Mrs. Kanista Arti Hensman, and the Editor of the Conference, Dr. T. Karunaharan. We warmly welcome you onto the stage. Thank you. May I now invite Professor K. Sri Ganeshan, convener of ICDE 2025, to deliver the welcome address.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Honorable Vice Chancellor, Honorable Dean, Co-Chair, Head Co-Chair, respected Professor Penstead, Suresh Kannadaraja, and other dignitaries on the dais, and ladies and gentlemen. It's my great privilege to welcome you all to this international conference on decolonizing English. First of all, I would like to welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, although he is the chair of this conference, and also the Dean of the Faculty. He's also the co-chair of the conference, along with our head, Dr. Shanmuganathan. And may I welcome Professor Stephen May, the keynote speaker today from University of Auckland, New Zealand. And of course, our warm welcome to our own Professor Suresh Kannadaraja. And then may I welcome our Honorable Professor Dushanti Mendish from University of Colombo, and also Professor Gu Minki Mitchell of the Education University of Hong Kong, and Professor Alize Kogo from University of London, UK. And also, I would like to welcome the former Vice Chancellors, former Deans of the Faculties, present Deans of the Faculties, Honorable Professors, Honorable dignitaries from all over the world, and our own students and the invitees from the departments. Thank you very much. Welcome you all.
Thank you, sir. Now, may I call one of our co-chairs of the conference, Professor S. Raghuram, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, University of Jaffna, to address the gathering.
Good morning, Vice Chancellor and Conference Chair, distinguished guests, respected scholars, keynote speakers, colleagues and students. It is with great pride and honor that I welcome you all to the first international conference on decolonizing English, organized by the Department of English Language Teaching, Faculty of Arts, University of Jaffna. This conference marks an important milestone, not only for university and department, but also for the broader academic community engaged in critical and timely discussions on the role of English in post-colonial and multilingual context. As one of the co-chairs of this significant event, I am delighted to be a part of this much-needed platform that challenges us to rethink, reframe, and reimagine the place of English and English language teaching in Sri Lanka. Our conference theme, Decolonizing English, is not just an academic search. It is a call to integrate the historical legacies, power structures, and linguistic hegemonies that continue to shape our classrooms, curricula, and identities. It invites us to listen to local voices and create space for multilingual realities to thrive in our teaching and research practices. We are deeply honored to welcome two distinguished keynote speakers whose work has shaped the discourse on multilingualism and linguistic justice, Professor Stephen May from University of Auckland, New Zealand, and Professor Alize Kogo from University of London. We are truly grateful for your presence and your contribution to this critical dialogue. In addition to the keynote addresses, the conference will feature technical sessions, a spotlight session, plenary speeches, and panel discussion on critical issues on English and ELT in Sri Lanka. These diverse formats will provide participants with rich opportunities to share insights, engage in critical debates, and build collaborative networks across the disciplines. I take this opportunity to extend my heartfelt thanks to the head and staff of the Department of English Language Teaching, for their vision, dedication, and tireless efforts in bringing this conference to life. We are also deeply indebted to Professor Suresh Kanagaraja of Pennsylvania State University, USA, whose invaluable guidance and coordination have greatly shaped the intellectual direction and success of this event. Thank you, sir. A special word of thanks goes to Professor K. Sri Ganeshan, the convener of the conference, for his leadership and meticulous organization. In closing, let me say this: decolonizing English is not a one-time conversation, it is a continuous collective process. As we engage with one another for coming 3 days, let us to do some with openness, humility, and shared commitment to justice, equity, and transformation in English studies and beyond. Thank you, and I wish you all the meaningful and inspiring conference. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, sir. Now, I call upon another one of our conference co-chairs, Dr. K. Shanmuganathan, Head of the Department of English Language Teaching, University of Jaffna, to deliver his address.
Respected Vice Chancellor, the co-chair of this conference, and Professor Isragram, Dean, Faculty of Arts, the co-chair, Stephen May, the keynote address that he has come here to make it. Professor Kanagaraja, he is the patron and the support that to conduct this conference. And Professor Dushanti Mendis is a plenary speaker. Michelle from Hong Kong, that is also one of the plenary speakers here. And Mr. Jenny, then the convener of this program, and the editor and the secretary, and the former vice chancellors of this university, Emeritus Professor, the Tamil scholar, Professor Shanmugadas, and the ELT practitioners, scholars from different nations, and birth of students gathered here. Good morning to you all. The idea of conducting this first international conference conceived some months back, and now we had delivered a new baby in the name of Decolonizing English. Before I go into that theme, I would like to brief about the DELT and its activities there. So the DELT, the former, it was called as English Language Teaching Center, that it was promoted as DELT, Department of English Language Teaching, considering the significance of imparting language skills to the undergraduates being enrolled to the different state universities in Sri Lanka. And it is located in the Faculty of Arts and served different faculties attached to the University of Jaffna. So DELT has designed different syllabuses that depends on the needs of the faculties. Under the name of English for Specific Purposes, that's the umbrella term we use it for, that the faculty-wise that we had different specific courses for it. And there are more than 25 staff, including visiting. We served for the betterment of the graduates in enhancing the language skills. So when you talk about the language, there are two dichotomies that we can see, the English language and ELT. English language teaching based the form, the fundamental language skills for the students who wants to excel in their academic disciplines there. In that way, we talk about the global English due to the globalization that brought the nations together very close. Then the global English that leads to the rapid spread of English language teaching across the countries. And their main role is to provide the opportunities for the students for their socio-economic mobility nationally and globally. So now the theme decolonizing English, not only English that we need decolonizing in all sort of disciplines in a country, because in order to maintain the identity and the culture of the people who lives in a country. In that way, decolonizing English means the language we always speak about, the American English and the British English. We never talk about the other Englishes spoken in the world. So in that way, that is actually English language is seen as the colonial power. It's the colonial language that always has the dominance over the other languages there. So that causes an impact of the indigenous languages and the culture. As a result, the people, they are in a position to lose their identity. The language always reflects the identity and the culture of the people. In that way, localizing the English language teaching that can promote the language learning as well as their indigenous language. So that is an equitable approach that can be done. So when you talk about the pedagogy that being used in the current ELT practices, the ELT pedagogy that suggests the methods, approaches and techniques that being used in our day-to-day classrooms is most the West-centric approach. So the introduction of linguistic theories that pave the way for the introduction of new different pedagogy methods. But we cannot be very happy that we are unable to produce the students with the communicative competence that is being unreachable fruit, not only in Sri Lanka, but the other countries that comes under the colonial power. So in that way that we need a different approach to teach English. So that's what we have organized this conference in collaboration with Professor Suresh Kanagaraja. He's a wonderful professor that she worked with us for months, and so Delhi is very proud of it that earlier we had a symposium under the headship of Dr. Mrs. K. Sivaji. And now that we have the first international conference, is the first step that we will go on the other years to have more conferences like this. At the same time that I would like to raise this, our respected Vice Chancellor often that raises a question that Shan, there were eminent teachers, they don't have any research experience, they don't have any academic degrees, but they were very successful in producing the learners with communicative competence that he realized it. So in that way, that's if you go through the textbooks that being used in the school curriculum and in the tertiary education, that's if you go through it, it has the colonialism, that's the English Everyday series that was designed by Mosbeck. He was brought from England to design. That was not more suitable, it was the failure one that because the text involved that is not in their local culture. So in that way that I take this opportunity to thank our respected Vice Chancellor for his valuable support and cooperation in this to take this successful conference, and also our Dean, Professor Rauram, that he is always very close with me. He worked, then whatever I ask that he never say no. So that's way that I thank both in this conference. Thank you so much for it.
Thank you, sir. May I now invite Dr. T. Karunakaran, editor of the International Conference on Decolonizing English 2025, to share a few words.
Respected Vice Chancellor and the conference chair, co-chairs, Professor Avram, Dr. K. Shanmanathan, the convener, Professor Sri Ganeshan, the Professor Suresh Kanagaraja, who is the backbone of this conference, the keynote speaker, Professor Stephen May, and the plenary speaker, Professor Dushyant Mendes, the other plenary speaker, Professor Gu Minjia Michel, editor, the secretary, the dignitaries of the dais, professors, lecturers, deans, former vice chancellors, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning all. First of all, I would like to welcome you all for the first international conference organized by DELT, University of Jaffna. At the outset, I would like to thank Professor Suresh Kanagaraja for taking the initiative to organize this first international conference on the theme Decolonizing English. And he's the one who has supported us to move on, because this was the first time we started this international conference, to organize this international conference. So he was the one who constantly gave academic counseling and support. So I take this opportunity to thank him. And then I would like to thank our Vice Chancellor, who also has been an inspiration for us, because he constantly encourages us to involve in research and deliberations. So then I would like to thank Professor Rahuram, the Dean, Faculty of Arts, for his continuous support to our department. So then I also would like to thank the head and the convener for being being supportive to me throughout this process. We received 145 abstracts, and out of 145, we incorporated only 94. Some of the presenters, they have withdrawn their abstracts due to various difficulties to attend this conference in person. So again, I would like to thank for all the presenters who have assembled here, and it is my bounden duty to thank all the reviewers, because some of the reviewers reviewed more than 4 or 5 abstracts. So I take this opportunity to record my sincere thanks at this moment. As an editor of this conference, I am pleased to present the proceedings of the conference. And finally, I would like to thank all who have been supportive to make this event a successful one. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now it's crucial time. We are going to launch the proceedings, and may I invite our conference chair and VC, Vice Chancellor of the University, Professor Sri Satkunaraja, to launch our proceedings. Our editor will hand over the first copy to the conference chair now. Thank you, sir. May I invite our conference chair and the vice chancellor to hand over special copies to our guests. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. It is now my privilege to invite our conference chair, Professor S.R. Satkunaraja, Vice Chancellor of the University of Jaffna, to address the gathering.
திருச்சிற்றம்பலம் வேண்டத்தக்கது அறிவோய் நீ வேண்ட முழுதும் தருவோய் நீ வேண்டு மயன்மார்க்கு அறியோய் நீ வேண்டி என்னை பணிகொண்டாய் வேண்டி நீயே அருள் செய்தால் யானும் அதுவே வேண்டினேன் அல்லால் வேண்டும் பரிசு என்று ஒன்று உண்டெனில் அது முந்தன் விருப்பென்றோ. So we are human beings in this beautiful planet Earth. It's a blue planet. It's wonderful. So I'm a mathematician, we dig on the cosmology. So Stephen Hawking said it's originated from a point. Now it's getting expanded because so many activities are taking place. So evolving. So now as a human beings, the fundamental thing we have been taught when we were in the school. So ancient time, we are struggling to or endeavoring to support our physical existence. That is our food, clothing and dwelling. Now these were the inevitable things for us. Now the things are different. So inevitable thing, one of them is English, other one is IT. So there are, and the list is expanding now. So whether you are decolonizing or colonizing, the English is now inevitable thing. So people talk about empowerment, that's inclusion, mainstreaming. These are the words now being uttered everywhere. So empowerment go with education, then economic development, then another English, then employment. Because it's a globalized world. Now, I don't know, even after economic crisis, our government said, leave the country, 5 years visas are given, now freedom is given to go. So, Tirakadalodian, Tiraviyan. So, it's from ancient time we have been, even colonization took place because of looking for wealth. So, wealth also associated with education, Tanam Dharam, Kalli Dharam. So education now, in our faculty, in the universities, there are 12 faculties, except humanities. Most of the faculties are, the medium of instruction is English. It's irony, because students are coming from various backgrounds. I think I was having a chat with our keynote speaker, Stephen. He's going to speak about it. So I don't want to dig into the matter because time is running out. So this is the time, I said in this hymn I started, it said everything is a gift. The body is a gift. It came from parents, Mada, Pita. Then the Guru, they imparted knowledge. That's what we are here today. Even Suresh was an indigenous man from St. John's College and Kelaniya University and University of Jaffna. And now he's an international figure. So this English language is a global language. Even I am coming from the maths department. The mathematics is a universal language. So language is not a new thing. It's ancient. The mathematics is a very ancient thing from European Renaissance or Arabic thing, or everywhere it's happened, Indian, Chinese. And now we have speakers from Hong Kong, Mitchell Madam, and our plenary speaker from Colombo, Dushanti Madam, and also from New Zealand. It's a new country, dynamic, it's growing, our Stephen May, and above all, our gentleman from Pennsylvania. So any good things happen because of three things: charity, or the money, then the knowledge, and then the sacrifice, or the perseverance of the people. So today's event is one of the top celebration, incredible event in the annals of the Department of English Language Teaching. Congratulations, son, that it's happened your time. And also we want to pay our gratitude to our friend Suresh Kanagaraja. I don't know, he's a very distinguished family also. His brother is another Vice Chancellor from Leicester, Nishan, he was here, and another one from Cambridge, Sudarshan, economics professors. So all they had education here, but this language helped them to get into the Everest. It's a tool. Without tool, you can't do anything, because even the MIT or Harvard or all doing well, because the laboratories are state-of-the-art laboratories. Even if you want to desire to do something, it's facilitated. So that's the money matters. And the Pennsylvania, we are grateful to Pennsylvania University and Suresh for arranging all the funding. That's what it's become international. All people have come from various aspects, discipline, and various parts of the countries. The world has assembled here. So we have a desire for knowledge. That's a human being's innate thing, desire for knowledge. We are endeavoring in all disciplines. Now the knowledge expansion is taking place in the exponential manner. The period of doubling of the knowledge is halving. So many publications, so many disciplines, and expanding. So in this respect, the knowledge for, thirst for knowledge. The Jaffna man dig well to quench a thirst. And now even the tradition, we know 200 years of tradition we have in the undergraduate education in this part of the world. So it's a blessing of the missionaries. So you can't say colonization, the blessing of the missionaries. We have started the best Western education in this part of the world. It's a pioneering in the country, also in the South Asia, maybe in the Pacific Asia. And also we had a Western medical system started here in Velur, and our Samuel Green in Panatharippu. So we have a strong tradition. So everything will be preserved and progress only by hearing from the wise, sharing the knowledge. Now the globalized world, the sharing is the important thing. Information superhighways are open. Even today events are captured, is in the live stream. So that's the way things are expanding. Don't think this is international conference is confined to this auditorium alone. It's now entire universal broadcast is there live. So this is what's happening now. So opportunities are coming. So live broad opportunity. I have been here 41 years. I witnessed so many things in this part of the world. The conflict affected us. Now we are coming out of the conflict and one of the expanding universities. Thank you for all for gathering here, because your coming actually cherish us and also make this event as an incredible event. Thank you very much, our keynote speakers, plenary speakers, and participants. All wonderful. Have a good time. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time for keynote lecture. To introduce our distinguished keynote speaker, may I now call upon Mr. V. Parandaman, a senior academic staff member of DELT.
Good morning to all. We are really honored and excited to have our renowned and reputed academic personality, Professor Stephen May, to deliver his keynote address during our first international conference conducted by DELT. I am extremely delighted to introduce our keynote speaker. Stephen May is a professor in T. Puna Wananga School of Maori and Indigenous Education in the Faculty of Arts and Education, University of Auckland, New Zealand. He is an international authority on language rights, language policy, language revitalization, language education, especially indigenous, bilingual, and multilingual education, critical multiculturalism, and the multilingual turn. To date, he has published 26 books and over 120 articles and chapters in these areas. Since 2022, he has been named in the top 2% of scientists globally in the fields of linguistics and education in Stanford University citation. Professor Stephen is the Deputy Chair of the Royal Society of New Zealand's Academic Executive Committee and a member of the RSNZ Council. He was the co-chair of the New Zealand Performance-Based Research Fund BPRF Education Panel for the 2026 round until its dissolution by the current New Zealand government. He was the deputy chair of the PBRF Education Panel in the previous assessment cycle from 2016 to 2019. He was the Social and Behavioral Sciences convener for the Aparang Royal Society of New Zealand from 2019 to 2022. He has also previously been Deputy Dean responsible for research from 2012 to 2015 for the faculty. From 2018 to 2022, he was the director of the university's Tai Tokaro campus, Te Papa Echo, or Tai Tokaro Northland. Professor Stephen is also an honorary professor at the University of Tartu, Estonia, and at Taiwan University of Technology, China. In 2023, Professor Stephen received the Royal Society of New Zealand, the T. Aparangi Mason Dury Medal, awarded to New Zealand's preeminent social scientist. In 2018, he was awarded the Mackenzie Award by the New Zealand Association of Educational Research, NZARE, the preeminent award for educational research in New Zealand. In 2016, Professor Stephen was elected a T. Aparangi Royal Society of New Zealand Fellow. In 2015, he became an American Educational Research Association, AERA Fellow. Professor Stephen is the editor-in-chief, series editor of the 10-volume Encyclopedia of Language and Education, 3rd edition, Springer, 2017, and the founding editor of the international interdisciplinary journal, Ethnicities. From 2005 to 2015, he was also an associate editor of Language Policy. Professor Stephen began his professional career as a secondary teacher of English and ESL in New Zealand and has subsequently taught in universities in New Zealand, Britain, USA, and Canada. The latter include the Sociology Department of the University of Bristol, UK, where he remains affiliated with the Center of the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship, and the University of Waikato, where he was a foundation professor of language and literary education. Sir, now the microphone is yours. We welcome you to deliver your keynote address on negotiating national languages, English as a world language, and individual multilingualism in the global South. Welcome.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ka nui te mihi kia koutou, I te tuatahi mea wahi kia ki tātua, I tūrua karoria ki o tātou nei tupuna, hiki mai ki a tātou me te honga ora tēnā tātou katoa, tēnā koutou kua taimai nei, kua huhi mai nei I tēnei wā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings everyone, I greet you in the indigenous language of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Te Reo Māori, the Māori language. Since we are decolonizing English, we shall not only speak in English today, hopefully. My thanks to the Vice-Chancellor, to the conference chairs and coordinators, to the Dean, to my good friend and colleague, Professor Suresh Kanakaraja, for the privilege of being able to speak with you today. It's my first time in Sri Lanka. And so it's an additional privilege to be here with you in Jaffna. I want to talk today around some broader issues in relation to English, particularly as a world language, but also the intersection of national languages and our preoccupation with those in our particular contexts, and how that impacts on our individual bilingualism and multilingualism. But I thought I should start, since you may not know me and you may not know New Zealand so well, with a little bit of my background. So I am a New Zealander. I did spend 10 years in Britain working, completing a PhD and then working at the University of Bristol. But 10 years of English rugby, if you've watched English rugby, is enough for anyone. So I came back to New Zealand after that, and I've been back in New Zealand since then. But just in terms of the New Zealand context, since it was mentioned earlier, I mean, New Zealand is also a British settler colonial state, colonised by the UK. We don't have the Portuguese and Dutch as you do here prior to that, but we do have the English, and as a result I am a direct descendant of those white settlers. We call them Pākehā New Zealanders, white New Zealanders. My great-grandparents arrived on the appropriately named ship, the the SS British Empire in Auckland in 1880, and so I have 5 generations of New Zealand behind me, but a direct legacy of colonialism. And in the particular area that I grew up, I lived in a resolutely monolingual and monocultural and a very oriented place towards Britain. This is the school I went to. It looks like a British public school. It sort of very much followed that kind of tradition. And so that was my background, a white New Zealander, monolingual, largely monocultural, very little engagement with the indigenous Māori people in Aotearoa, and even less with the Māori language. And so as a result of that, when I began teaching in secondary school, as was mentioned, I decided to learn Te Reo Māori, the Māori language, as an adult. And it was really from that that I began to become interested in issues of language policy, Indigenous language revitalisation, broader issues of bilingualism and multilingualism. So that's my personal and professional background. I've approached these academically from sort of key areas: language rights, Indigenous language and other forms of bilingual education. And I've also been prominent in discussions along with Suresh and others around the multilingual turn in teaching and learning. And most recently, although I won't talk about this today, I have also been looking more closely at issues of linguistic racism. So that's the background I bring. I work and teach in the University of Auckland in New Zealand. I teach in English and Te Reo Māori, and I have been doing so for the last 20 years since my return to New Zealand. But what I want to look at, as I said today, are some broader issues, just perhaps to frame some of the key themes of the conference today. And I want to begin with 3 observations, and I want to just very briefly explain the first. For any of you who have undertaken linguistics as a subject, you will have, of course, come across the famous linguist Noam Chomsky. And Chomskyan linguistics remains dominant. I was talking to Suresh about this just recently. The influence of Chomskyan linguistics remains very large and very wide. But I never liked Chomsky, and I never liked Chomskyan linguistics. And it was because, in the end, I realized it had no sense of agency. There was nothing in Chomsky's approach to linguistics that allowed for individual agency. So I was quite surprised when I came across a quote by Noam Chomsky that I actually like, and I give it to you here. In his book, in 1979, he makes this comment: questions of language are basically questions of power. That's the first observation. The second comes from another American linguist, Max Weinreich, who in the 1940s was attributed with this comment: a language is a dialect with an army and a navy. And this comment is pertinent because, as we know, linguistically it's quite hard often to distinguish among dialects. Linguistically, some dialects remain mutually unintelligible. Some languages are intelligible: Norwegian, Swedish, and and Danish are mutually intelligible. So what constitutes a language rather than a dialect tends to be whether it is recognized by a nation state. I'll come on to this, and the state apparatus that gives it privilege and power. So that's the second observation. These are just some things for you to just think about as I speak. And the third comes from the political philosopher Will Kimlicka, who talks about this. He says, leaving one's culture, and I've added in here, and one's language or languages, while possible, is best seen as renouncing something to which one is reasonably entitled. Now we know that language shift and loss occurs around the world, and in fact we're facing an exponential language shift and loss, particularly of indigenous languages, where many are presumed or we're being told may no longer survive by the end of this century. Up to 50% of the world's languages, most of which are indigenous languages. So language shift and loss has always occurred, but never to this extent and never at this rate. And so Kimlicka's observation is a very poignant one, because while language shift and loss does clearly occur, the question is, does it have to? So with those initial observations, let me turn to what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about, as I said, the intersection of national languages, and then I want to talk about English as a world language, and then I want to talk about both of those things in relation to their impact on individual bilingualism or multilingualism. So let's start with language and national identity. When we think of the nation state, Sri Lanka or New Zealand or wherever it may be, there are two questions that inevitably come up. The first is whether speaking the national language, and usually it's only one. Here it's two, as I understand it, with English as a linked language now, post 2009. But generally speaking, there are one, two, or at most a few languages that are recognized as national languages. And the question is whether speaking those languages are or should be a requirement of national citizenship. And then the second question is whether this requirement should be at the expense of, or in addition to, the maintenance of other languages, what we call minority or non-dominant languages, usually the languages of everyday life, the languages of the family, of the community, of those around us, particularly in multilingual contexts. And what is interesting and alarming about those two questions is that there is inevitably one answer, that public monolingualism, or at most a very delimited public bi-multilingualism, should be privileged at all costs, and often at the expense of those other languages. And this is a legacy, in terms of the work that I've been doing, of nationalism over the last few centuries, and the nation-state model. So I just want to unpack that a little bit, and for you to think about it in terms of the post-colonial Sri Lankan context, which you will of course be much more familiar with than I am. I talk about this in the book, my book, Language and Minority Rights, and I look at the history of monolingualism, and particularly the preoccupation with this notion of public monolingualism. And what I discuss there, as many others have also, is that this is a product of the modern nation-state system, and it's only really been around for the last few centuries. And what we've seen in this model is that national languages are chosen, and they then replace other languages or dialects, as they're often subsequently described. This is achieved, as many of you will know, by language selection. We select a language. By standardization, we standardize it, and then we institutionalize it, crucially, most often through education. And this is a political process, it's not a linguistic one. So this is around the politics of state-making. And these reinforce, or they are reinforced by what Tony Lidecote calls linguistic hierarchies of prestige. So national languages are seen as modern, as progressive, as outward-looking, and in this model that we've come to internalize, other languages are seen as parochial, or as delimiting, or as antediluvian, also as sort of not fit for the modern world. And so that's why so often these language speakers over time shift to more dominant languages, and particularly to national languages. And just if we unpack this notion of monolingualism a little bit more, there's a very influential book by the American sociolinguist David Gramling that came out in 2016 called The Invention of Monolingualism, where he was exploring these same issues. And just a couple of quotes from him. The first is, he's talking about monolingualism here, whether we opt to call it a myth, a pathology, a paradigm, a relic, or a sham. Monolingualism is woven into modernity's most minute and sophisticated political structures. This is the nation-state model that I'm referring to. And its underlying principle, he says, has never quite been that other languages are bad or inferior, but that they are contextually unnecessary. Only national languages, and as we'll see, increasingly people argue this about English as a world language as well, are important. Monolingualism thus manages other languages, it doesn't oppose them. I don't quite agree with Gramling in that respect. I think this process actually does oppose other languages, but be that as it may, this is a very sort of interesting critique. Monolingualism, this preoccupation with monolingualism is recent, and it tends to be hegemonic and delimiting in terms of other languages. And yet, the world wasn't always like that. So prior to the nation state, we had empires, many of which, not all, but many of which were multilingual. They were not preoccupied with imposing public monolingualism on their populace. So I have two examples here from China. So the Qing Empire, 1644 to 1911, we saw over that time particularly Manchu, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, and Chinese as languages that were used extensively and multilingually in that empire. And in fact, Manchu was initially promoted as a common language before the rise of Chinese, particularly in the 20th century, superseded it. So here's an example of a multilingual script from that time. You'll see, reading from left to right in a very Western ethnocentric way, Manchu on the left, Tibetan, Mongolian, Uyghur, and Chinese. And so, as I said, empires, and this is true also in the West as well, the Roman Empire being another example, but I'll give you a second example since I was talking with my colleague Jenny about this yesterday. Dunhuang on the Silk Road, which is down in the Gansu province, just below the Gobi Desert in northwestern China. There were a whole range of documents that were retrieved that were stored in a library from the 9th and 10th centuries, which showed that this particular town was a multilingual hub on the Silk Road. And here's another example from that time. This is a Sanskrit prayer, which is transliterated into Tibetan, and it also has interlineal Chinese notations. So the point I'm making is that multilingual empires, which survived through to the 20th century, if we think of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, many of these saw multilingualism as the norm. They didn't require those within their borders to speak one language or only a few, as long as taxes were paid, all was well. So as I said, this, although we take it for granted, our common nation-state model has become so normalized, but it wasn't always, nor should it necessarily always be the case. But this is how things are now. The modern nation-state is built on the notion of nation-state congruence, which basically holds that boundaries of political and national identity should coincide, and they should be represented by a national language. And the result of that is linguistic homogeneity and the ascendancy of national languages, as I've said. In the work that I do around language rights, I've also talked about this in terms of the processes I briefly described before, so I won't rehearse this too much, but just to say that generally what it involves is official recognition of a language or two languages, as is the case here with English as a linked language. But most importantly, it's really through education that these languages come to be normalized and come to be dominant. And then the process of status language planning, as we call it, involves standardizing the language. We select it, we codify it, we elaborate it through dictionaries, and then we implement it. And the result of that is what the French anthropologist and sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls a single linguistic community. And so this is just a quote from him. In order for one language to impose itself as the only legitimate one, the linguistic market has to be unified, and other language varieties or different dialects have to be measured practically against the legitimate language or their uses, and they're often measured negatively. Integration into the single linguistic community is the condition for the establishment of relations of linguistic domination. And if we think of the history of Sri Lanka in this context, in terms of the post-colonial context, the 1956 language laws that were a key catalyst, or one of the key catalysts for political unrest here over many subsequent decades, language is often a catalyst for wider social and political division, particularly if it's imposed. And so he goes on to say, Bourdieu, measure de facto against a single language, a single standard of the common language, other languages are found wanting and cast into the outer darkness of regionalisms or dialects or patois, as they were called in France. And just two other quotes very briefly. The American sociolinguist Nancy Dorian talks about the fact that this concept of the nation state, coupled with its official standard language, has in modern times posed the keenest threat to both the identities and the languages of small communities. And Florian Kormus, the German sociolinguist, says even more succinctly, the nation state is the natural enemy of minorities and minority languages. So why is that particularly troubling? Well, because the homogeneous nation state is actually a social and political fiction. We never have had, nor will we ever have, a single homogeneous nation state with only one ethnic group and one national language, or at least a causal link between the two. Even majority languages change over time. So one majority population might actually be usurped by another, and so even majority ethnic groups and their languages don't necessarily survive. And we also have in most nation states what we call national minorities or indigenous peoples. So in New Zealand, my country colonised by the British, Māori were and remain the indigenous people who preceded the British by over 1,500 years, or between 1,000 and 1,500 years. And so in many contexts we have indigenous peoples around the world. We also have national minorities. I did my PhD on Welsh language policy in Wales, where Welsh is regarded as a national minority language. It's always been in that area, but it was subsumed and excluded from public life by the English, particularly from the time of Henry VIII onwards. And Scotland, Scottish Gaelic or Ireland, Irish Gaelic, Catalan and Basque in Spain, Quebecois French in Canada are other examples of national minority languages. And then of course we have the rapidly rising, burgeoning, expanding migration and transmigration in this current increasingly globalized age. And so we have migrant groups, particularly in major urban cities around the world. So in Auckland, although New Zealand is only a country of 5.5 million people, and it's geographically at the very south of the world, quite distant, an 18-hour flight from here via Singapore. 160 languages, nonetheless, are still spoken currently in Auckland in terms of the census. In London, where the notion of superdiversity, which I'll talk about briefly shortly, was first examined, there are over 300 languages spoken in the London metropolitan area. So we have this extensive individual multilingualism, often in the context of cities in relation to migrants and transmigrants, those who come and go, but also we have, as I said, national minority languages and indigenous languages as well. So most states are what the philosopher Will Kimlicka, who I mentioned at the start, called either multinational. They either have a majority national population and minority national or indigenous peoples, or they're polyethnic, the term he uses to describe those who are migrants in new contexts. And he argues, and this is true of course, that most countries in the world have historically been or remain, and generally remain today, a combination of the two. So that brings me to issues of language and citizenship, and I just want to rehearse very briefly here some related issues in terms of the current preoccupation with public monolingualism in nation states. Again, if you look at discussions of citizenship, particularly in political theory, public monolingualism is again the preoccupation. So citizenship is seen as something that's dissociated from your cultural and linguistic background. Whatever languages you have, whatever your culture, whatever your heritage, that's not important. We are all citizens of the state, but citizenship is generally framed within the dominant ethnic or the dominant linguistic groups. And as I said, that stands in contrast to empires who weren't so interested in prescribing that. And then, as we come to post-colonial contexts, which I'll talk to shortly soon, we end up often with this notion of diglossia, where private multilingualism is allowed, but there are still very clear language hierarchies, and local, indigenous, other languages are viewed as low status, useful for family, community, and other contexts, but not regarded as being prestigious or providing advantage. And of course, this is one of the key reasons why we see the increasing use of English medium instruction around the world, including here, because English as a world language also is taking up this mantle currently. And this is reflected in early language policy. So I'm not, you'll be much more familiar with Sri Lanka in terms of the post-colonial context in language policy, but generally from the 1950s to the 1970s, early language policy scholars and practitioners basically adopted what they thought was a non-political, non-ideological, pragmatic response to the language problems of post-colonial states. And what they did basically was that they took majority, generally the ex-colonial languages, and promoted those languages as languages of wider communication, as lingua franca, and minority languages were, as I said, allowed to be in diglossic contexts within family and community, but weren't regarded as useful languages beyond that. And they had this idea of the fact of stable diglossia, that we could have stable diglossia with these local languages doing the everyday work, and then the national languages and international languages doing the cosmopolitan, global, national work. But there is no such thing as stable diglossia, because as we know, language shift and loss occurs when dominant languages inevitably push out minority languages. And so Alan Luke, for example, observes that early language policy and planning tended to avoid directly addressing social and political matters within which language change, use and development, and indeed language planning itself, are embedded. So this non-critical approach really simply replicated some of the language hierarchies from the colonial era into and ongoing within the post-colonial context. And then if we look at how this has expanded one level up, if we think of now English as a world language, we see these same kinds of movements in globalization. So globalization sees the same pressure for linguistic homogeneity, particularly via English as a world language. And so Jan Blomet, for example, talks about this in his 2010 book, The Sociolinguistics of Globalization, where he talks about two types of globalization: geopolitical globalization, which arises out of the ongoing expansion of capitalism, But for our purposes here, he talks about geocultural globalization, also a feature of late capitalism, very tied up with new technologies, digital technologies, as the Vice-Chancellor mentioned, the rise of artificial intelligence, AI. These are current debates that we're having in relation to language teaching particularly, but also more broadly. And then also in terms of this notion of business process outsourcing that David Gradol talks about, where multinational companies outsource their communications or their production to generally the global south as a way of lessening their own costs, and this sees the expansion of English into global south context, but in very specific ways, which I'll come back to shortly. But more broadly, what globalization continues to do, despite those who think it's a wholly good thing, is it tends to reinforce wider social inequalities rather than ameliorating them. So let me turn to English as a world language. Abraham de Swan, in a book, Words of the World in 2000, talked about globalization proceeding in English. People will have to live with both English and their domestic language and seek a feasible accommodation between the two. So he's basically saying English is now so dominant that we must be bilingual, and we must be bilingual in English. And he did an analysis of the world's languages by what he called the Q value. And the higher the Q value of the language, the greater its communicative reach, significance, and usefulness. So he identified about 100 central languages, he called them. These were mainly national languages. And then he identified what he called super-central languages, 12 of them: English, Arabic, Mandarin, Spanish, French, German, Hindi, Japanese, Malay, Portuguese, Russian, and Swahili. And finally, he identified one hyper-central language, English. And more recently, another political theorist, Philippe van Parijs, a Belgian theorist, wrote this book, Linguistic Justice for Europe and for the World, because of course if you're a European, you can tell the rest of the world what to do. But nonetheless, this is a useful book, but it also has a very similar ideological stance, basically arguing that English is now so dominant that we must learn it. And he talks about this in relation to the notion of probability-driven learning. I won't go into this in any detail, except to say that English is now so dominant that we must learn it as a language. And in fact, it's more important to learn it as a language because the cost of not learning it tends to be much higher than the cost of learning it. And he relates two key issues in this: motivation to learn English and the opportunity to learn English. And this explains the rise of English medium instruction around the world, particularly across Asia, as higher education, but also schooling, compulsory schooling, is looking at introducing English medium instruction as a way of gaining greater access to English as a world language. And he comes up with the idea that we now live in a highly mobile, intense communication world, and he has this notion of the maxi-min principle, that basically more and more people end up speaking English because we always opt for the language of widest communication, even if the proficiency level is quite low. So you might be speaking in Tamil, for example, and you come into, or someone comes into the conversation who's an English speaker and doesn't speak Tamil, and so what we often see is that those speakers switch to English, even if their proficiency in English is less than it is in Tamil, but it's in order to include a wider number of speakers. So this is the maxi-min principle that Van Parijs talks about. And this is how he explains why English is rapidly becoming a much sought-after language, and often seen as the answer to all of our linguistic problems. So in trying to draw this to a close, let me just give some critical responses to these arguments, just for you to ponder, since we are trying to decolonize English here. And I want to do so by highlighting 4 key responses for you to consider in terms of drawing this to a close. The first is coming back to Noam Chomsky's comment that questions of language are always questions of power, is we have to think about when we are promoting languages and in what fora or what forums we are promoting them, who is most advantaged and who is disadvantaged. And we have to therefore always look at issues of language in relation to wider issues of inequality that the philosopher Wallerstein talks about organising the flows across the globe. So who's advantaged, who's disadvantaged? One of the key arguments in, for example, promoting English as a world language is that it makes us more cosmopolitan, that we're able to engage not only in our own context but around the world. But the question is, who is able to be cosmopolitan? And again, the sociologist Craig Calhoun talks about this as what he calls the frequent flyer view of linguistic identity. It's generally those of us who can travel, those of us who have passports, those of us who are economically advantaged, those of us who have the facility or the wherewithal to be cosmopolitan, but they tend to be us elites, and many people don't even have a passport. So the question is, again, who, when we talk about the notion of cosmopolitan, who are we actually speaking about? And so in order to have an understanding of this more critical perspective, we need to take an historical rather than a simply presentist or a contemporary view. And so that's what I want to do and remain in the three remaining issues that I want to highlight. So this is for you to think about. Often English is touted as the answer to social mobility, much in the same way as national languages were touted as progressive, modernist, the key to the future. That was the nation-state model, as I mentioned. We're now seeing these same discourses in English as an international language. And this is what Van Price says, English not only enables the rich and the powerful, but also the poor and the powerless to communicate, debate, network, cooperate, lobby, and demonstrate effectively across borders. But as I've said, I think that's a simplistic notion, and so Jan Blomet talks about what is globalizing is not an abstract language, but specific forms, specific language varieties, and the way in which such globalized varieties enter into local environments will differ depending on the context. They differ in New Zealand widely from here and from other contexts. So every context is localized, and that involves a reordering of the multilingual repertoires that exist in this local context, how they relate to English, and how the linguistic hierarchies relate in relation to them. So English is not a monolithic category. There are English language varieties that are locally specific and which differ widely and are used for different purposes and are available to different extents, as I'll go on to talk about. So when we talk about world languages, world Englishes rather, and English as a lingua franca, we need to keep that critical perspective in mind, that English is not just a neutral category, as the early work of Alistair Pennycook and others highlighted, but is always enmeshed in local contexts. And then we need to also think about this idea that the acquisition of national languages in the first instance, or English as a global language, inevitably leads to economic, social, educational mobility. And again, this is not always the case. In fact, it can be the obverse, it can be the reverse. It can actually reinforce existing social, economic and linguistic inequalities. And let me give you two examples of this in particular. I can't speak for Sri Lanka here, but this in relation to India at least, what we've seen historically is that up until the 1990s, English remained the preserve of a small, high-class elite. And even with the advent of business process outsourcing, as I mentioned earlier, which of course India has benefited from particularly in relation to publishing, for example, and technology, most of the world's academic publishing now is produced out of India. So that's an example of this business process outsourcing, information technology as well, but it remains, generally speaking, still within those who already have an existing command of high status English. And then if we look at Africa as another example, English as an official or co-official language is there in many African states, but in many of those African states, even though English is an official language, very few people actually speak English, or if they do, they speak it with very low levels of proficiency. And so the question is, to what degree does it then actually allow those English speakers to progress economically, educationally and socially? Well, it's a lot more complicated and a lot more contested than many people assume, given those imbalances. And Jan Blomet, the late Belgian sociolinguist, talked about this as an example of low mobility forms of English. So in his book, I think, Sociolinguistics of Globalization, he says, you know, if you're in an African town, you're a trader, you use English in those contexts, that's very useful and prestigious in that context. But if you went to London, you might then be recast in a deficit sort of perspective as a English language speaker of a dialect, English language dialect that is not viewed as prestigious. So the key point here is that learning English or any dominant language is not inherently detrimental in the abstract, but the context in which it occurs often means that it helps to reinforce psychological, social and cultural fragmentation. Thus, a global language like English can never fulfill the role that cosmopolitanism sets for it, that of helping those marginalised and oppressed by globalisation to be heard. So I suppose one of the key things I want to raise for you to consider in this conference around decolonizing English, English will be here, it's not going away, but the question is what types of English do we have access to? Who has access to those types of English? What are the implications of that for existing social structures, but also for more critical questions around mobility and the degree to which that can actually be achieved. And that's a particular question, quite a burning question in relation, as the Vice-Chancellor referred, to English medium instruction around the world, the degree to which it's actually efficacious, that it's actually efficient, or that it's actually achieving the aims that those who implement are hoping for. Some of these wider questions might allow us to think through how we might address some of those more tricky, contested areas. And then, just very briefly, and I'll draw this to a close, I've got two more points. What these views of English, but also national languages sort of presuppose is that language is simply an instrument of communication. And in fact, that linguistic diversity is also, therefore, consequently, an obstacle to communication. So coming back to the idea of the Tower of Babel, for example, that speaking many languages has been constructed historically as an obstacle to communication. And that's another reason for this emphasis on public monolingualism and the rise of English as an international languages. And it's also why local languages are not seen as particularly useful. So my final point is this, and this is the work I've been doing more recently, but also work in superdiversity by Blomet and others. And I'll just bring this to a close by talking about how we can promote public multilingualism more effectively, not just private monolingualism. And there are three strands to this. The first is what the American linguist Heinz Kloss talked about, the difference between tolerance and promotion-oriented rights. I'll explain that very shortly. Then Will Kimlicka, whom I mentioned, talks about the difference between self-government rights and polyethnic rights. I'll show you what that is. And then in my own work, I've applied this to languages. So Kloss talks about this distinction in this way, that states allow tolerance-orientated rights when they allow people to continue to speak the languages they know and use in everyday life in their private or community context, or their church context, or their religious context, whatever it might be. So they're not actually punished for continuing to be bilingual or multilingual. Although, as we know, in some contexts that still occurs and has occurred historically. Franco's Spain, and currently, for example, the Kurds in Turkey, for example, are groups that are specifically proscribed from using their own languages. But then he also talks about the notion of promotion-oriented rights, which is where states can recognise other languages, not just national languages and not just English, but these so-called local languages, and how we might go about that, particularly via education. And that then leads into Kimlicka, who talks about the fact that, going back to the fact that nation states are always both multinational and polyethnic, that we can actually recognise not only the language of the dominant group, but also the language of those groups who have always been in this territory as well, as has been the case here, particularly over the last decade or so, In my own context, Māori as an Indigenous language has been recognised and promoted, particularly since the 1980s, because prior to that it had been subsumed by colonisation. And so this is what Kimlicka describes as promotion-oriented rights. And we can even think about those ethnic minorities, the 160 language speakers in Auckland, for example, the 300 or so in London, and I'm not sure how many there are here in Jaffna or in Colombo, but the other languages that are spoken, how might we incorporate those or allow those languages to continue to be fostered rather than replaced? And in that regard, in my own work, I've talked about this in relation to two key legal principles, the notion of reasonableness and the notion of where numbers warrant. So reasonableness is that it shouldn't be unreasonable for the state to support other languages where they can, where numbers warrant. So we can't support every language speaker, or the state can't at least, because there are simply not the resources to do that. But where there are significant numbers of language speakers, then the state could and should perhaps provide, for example, education in those languages for those groups. We see this, for example, in Finland with Swedish speakers who've long lived there, Māori in New Zealand, as I've said, and so on. So the question is, even for those who are migrants, and this can also include migrants, in New Zealand we have Samoan speakers who are a very significant group, and increasingly, of course, Mandarin Chinese speakers, 33% of whom live in Auckland. So a third of Auckland's population are Asian New Zealanders, many of whom speak predominantly Mandarin. So just to draw this to a close, here are my conclusions. When we talk about decolonizing English, what does that involve? When we talk about individual and bilingualism and multilingualism and how we can promote it rather than subsume it or replace it, what are the implications and conclusions that we need to think about? Well, I think we need to challenge the unidirectional construction of both national and global languages like English and related language policies, that it's only these languages that end up promoting social mobility. It's only these languages that end up being important in the linguistic hierarchies of prestige. Because everyday languages, the languages we use every day, are incredibly important in terms of the context within which we live and work. One of the key issues I'm dealing with at the moment in New Zealand is this issue of linguistic racism. We have a new government that is similar to the Trump government in the US, and has decided to retrench a lot of the advances we've made in Māori language revitalisation over the last 50 years or so. And one of their key arguments is exactly this, that Māori might be important for cultural or identity purposes, but it's not a useful language. And my argument is that Māori, which is still the second most widely spoken language in New Zealand, is incredibly useful in New Zealand, where we live and work, because it's a language that you will most often hear in a wide variety of contexts. So knowing it is a very useful thing. So the idea that language use only equates to or aligns with language reach, i.e. international languages or national languages, is something that you need to critically question, and this is a particular concern for English as a world language. I think we need to, secondly, problematise diglossia, because it still doesn't change these linguistic hierarchies of prestige. It still leads to language loss and shift and linguistic inequality over time, unless there is some state support, as I said, particularly in education or through bilingual education being one key means. We need also, as I've argued, to complexify the presumption about language and social mobility, especially in relation to English as a global language, because it seems to me that it's only those who still tend to be existing elites who have high standard English language varieties that are the most socially mobile, but not all English language speakers, given the diversity of world Englishes, necessarily have the same privileges and opportunities. In terms of English medium instruction, I think there are two issues here. One is the issue of how effective it is, and often that's a proficiency issue in relation to students, but also sometimes teachers. So that's one issue. But the other issue is the pedagogies that we use, and often what we see in EMI education now is exactly what we saw in national dominant education previously, where we tell other language speakers to stop speaking and using their languages. We're just going to do English. That's the only language you can use. And then we wonder why those students struggle, because we don't allow them access to the languages they already know in order to leverage their language learning. So something to think about in terms of the discussions we have over the next few days is how effective are our pedagogies. I think we need to reconnect the notion of identity and usefulness. Languages are not just means of communication, they're not just tools, although they're important as tools, but they're not just tools. They also reflect who we are. And that's even if we're monolingual, they reflect who we are, and they certainly reflect our complex bi- or multilingual identities. So we need to think about both at the same time rather than seeing them as separate. And that allows us then to accommodate multiple linguistic identities rather than this replacement model that we've had with the nation-state system over the last few hundred years. And that means that we can also link and connect to all language users, not just those who are dominant language users, not just those who use elite language varieties of English or the dominant language, but how do we actually draw in all of those? And so that requires, I have argued in my own work, and I know Suresh and others have argued in theirs as well, that we need to actually celebrate and promote a multi-directional language policy that simultaneously encompasses and supports both the local and the national and the global simultaneously. That's not easy, but that should be, I think, if we want to continue to promote the multilingual repertoires of many of us in our local context, while also providing access to national and international languages, that's what we need to do. And so since Suresh is the promoter of this conference, I thought I would finish with a quote from his excellent 2005 volume, where he says this: "Celebrating local knowledge should not lead to ghettoizing minority communities or force them into an ostrich-like intellectual existence. Rather, a clear grounding in our location, our place, gives us the confidence to engage with knowledge from other locations as we deconstruct and reconstruct them for our own purposes. In a sense, such an epistemological practice would lead us beyond the global and local dichotomy to one that encompasses both." And so I hope we can hold that challenge from Suresh and from what I've discussed with you this morning over the next 3 days. And thank you once again very much for being able to speak with you today.
Thank you, Professor Stephen May, for your insightful keynote lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sri Satkunaraja, to present a token of appreciation to the keynote speaker, Professor Stephen May. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now time to remember the late Professor Harshana Rambukbela. Many of you may recall seeing his name and photograph among our plenary speakers in the flyers we circulated in January this year. When we invited him to be a plenary speaker, he graciously and readily accepted. Professor Ambukbala enjoyed a warm and enduring relationship with the Department of English Language Teaching at the University of Jaffna. Many of our staff members here today were his students. It is worth noting that he was the keynote speaker at the symposium we held in 2019. Such a gentle and generous soul is no longer with us today. On behalf of ICDE 2025, we take this solemn moment to pay tribute to the late Professor Harshana Rambukvela. Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly request you to please stand as we light the candle in his memory. I now invite our Vice Chancellor to come onto the stage to light the candle on behalf of the University of Jaffna. Next, I call upon Professor Suresh Kanagaraja to represent the academic community around the world. Finally, on behalf of the Postgraduate Institute of English, I invite Dr. Romola Rasul, Director of PGIE, to light the candle. Ladies and gentlemen, now let us observe a 1 minute of silence in prayerful remembrance of the late Professor Harshana Rambukvela. Thank you. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Thiruvarangan, the Head Department of Linguistics and English of the University of Jaffna, to deliver the memorial speech on Professor Rambukvela.
Good morning. On the 21st of April, in another continent, I woke up to the news of the passing of Harshana Rambukvela. The news came as a shock, as Harshana was part of a conversation in a WhatsApp group with me and many others a day or two ago. I had even read and responded to one of his posts while on the flight. I could not believe Harshana had indeed gone. Slowly recovering from the shock, I reflected on his life and work and the impact he had created on Sri Lanka's academic landscape and English studies. I wrote a short tribute on Facebook on the same day, and what I am reading today is a slightly expanded version of that original tribute. I met Harshana for the first time at a conference organized by the International Center for Ethnic Studies in 2013. During the conversations we had at the conference, I saw in him a humble, unpretentious, engaging scholar. We spoke about our papers and my graduate studies. My first impression was that Harshana was a scholar whom I could always turn to for conversation, insights, and clarity, and that impression lasted till his demise. Thereafter, I started to read Harshana's work and found it extremely helpful in thinking about the question of nation, an interest that Harshana and I shared. Harshana was a brilliant scholar with landmark publications in the areas of nationalism, post-colonial studies, and sociolinguistics. The crown of his intellect, his book, The Politics and Poetics of Authenticity, a cultural genealogy of Sinhala nationalism, has shaped and continues to shape the way many of us see, understand, and engage with nationalism and its various iterations. Harshana's theoretical interests came from the context that he was part of and the exclusionary violence that he had seen in his own life. Instead of taking a populist line, Harshana took a critical path. His writings spoke truth to power, questioned the edifices and icons of cultural authority, and invited us to see the connection between intellectual work and liberation. Within our education system too, Harshana was not an intellectual ensconced safely and comfortably in an ivory tower. Instead, as an activist intellectual, he ruffled many feathers and rocked many boats. He was critical of the neoliberal push on our education system and the many moves to privatize the system. He played an active role in the 6% of GDP for education campaign launched by the Federation of the University Teachers Association. Harshana and I were part of a group called Kupi Collective, which works towards creating discussions on topics and themes related to public education in Sri Lanka. Harshana always wanted our free public education system to flourish and create opportunities for those who have been socially and economically marginalized. He envisioned a democratic higher education system with public universities that uphold openness, academic freedom, social justice, and diversity as their central values. Harshana stood unwaveringly in solidarity with minorities and academics from minority communities when they were faced with persecution in Sri Lanka. For instance, when Dr. Kumaravadivel Guruparan was forced to resign from his position at our university due to a circular issued by the UGC at the behest of the military establishment, Harshana was one of the few academics who signed a statement condemning the UGC's action. He always spoke up against majoritarianism and called for justice for the violence that minorities had suffered. Harshana showed a genuine interest in democratizing English studies, making it a discipline that embraces students and scholars from the margins and peripheries of the country. He was also a staunch supporter of multilingualism and always promoted literary conversations across the linguistic divides observed in Sri Lanka. At the Gratian Trust, where I worked closely with Harshana, he encouraged events that promoted such conversations and connections. One such event that we could organize was a one-day program on Malayaha Tamil writings to mark the 200th anniversary of the arrival of Malayaha Tamils in Ceylon. He also played a central role in taking the Gratian Trust and its activities outside of Colombo to places like Galle and Jaffna. Harshana was a dear friend whom I could always rely on for reading recommendations and scholarly advice. His suggestions were immensely helpful in preparing the syllabus for the Teaching English Literature in Post-Colonial Context course that I teach here at the University of Jaffna. He also put me in touch with other scholars in the field when I was working on the reading list for the course. Harshana was looking forward to the conference we just started today. He was preparing for his keynote as early as January. We even had a conversation on WhatsApp on decolonizing English, and if there are situations in Sri Lanka where English is seen as a language of resistance by the minorities, especially in the context of majoritarian linguistic policies like in India. As many of us from English studies in Sri Lanka and across the world, including Harshana's colleagues, gather here to discuss themes that Harshana had an abiding passion for, we feel his absence, a haunting vacuum. Although Harshana has left too early, his work and legacy will continue to enrich and enlighten our work and our conversations. We will miss you, dear Harshana, forever. My deepest condolences to his family, friends, and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thiruvarangan, for so vividly bringing back the memories and highlighting the academic and societal contributions of Professor Rambukwala. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now reached the conclusion of our inaugural session. I invite Ms. Aarti Hensman, the Secretary of ICDE 2025, to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good morning, all of you. On behalf of the Department of English Language Teaching, University of Jaffna, and the entire organizing committee of the International Conference on Decolonizing English, I am honored to deliver the vote of thanks. First and foremost, we express our deepest gratitude to the conference patron, Professor Suresh Kanagaraja. His intellectual vision and generous support through his Ivanpoo University Professorship funds were instrumental in conceptualizing this conference. His ongoing engagement with our department has been a source of inspiration and strength, and we are truly grateful for his guidance and collaboration. Our heartfelt thanks go to the conference chair, Professor S. Sri Satkunaraja, the Vice Chancellor, University of Jaffna, for his steadfast support and encouragement, and to our conference co-chair, Professor S. Raghuram, the Dean, Faculty of Arts, for his dedicated involvement and exemplary academic leadership. We also extend our sincere appreciation to our conference co-chair and the head of the Department of English Language Teaching, University of Jaffna, Dr. K. Shanmuganathan, for his unwavering support and guidance throughout the planning and execution of this conference. We are honored by the presence of our keynote speakers, plenary speakers, panelists, and spotlight session speakers whose contributions have enriched the intellectual rigor of these events. Your insights have opened valuable pathways for reimagining English language teaching through a decolonial lens. A sincere word of appreciation goes to the session chairs and session coordinators who are eagerly awaiting to facilitate and engage in discussions. We are grateful to the Deputy Registrar, Faculty of Arts, and to the other administrative, logistical, and technical teams who worked tirelessly behind the scene to ensure everything runs smoothly. We extend special thanks to the Department of Drama and Theatre Arts for their beautiful welcome performance, which set the tone for our gathering with cultural resonance. We are really indebted to the Department of Information Technology, Faculty of Arts, University of Jaffna, for helping us in setting up the website of the conference. We also acknowledge our sponsors and especially the staff members of Department of English Language Teaching for their self-sponsorship. A word of appreciation goes to the VC Media and the Media Club, Student Society of Department of Media Studies for their excellent media coverage of the event. Our appreciation also goes to the authors of accepted abstracts, whose research forms the intellectual foundation of this conference, and to the reviewers for their thoughtful feedback that maintained the academic rigor of the conference. To all participants, well-wishers, and institutional partners, thank you for your presence and your support. Finally, I wish to express my heartfelt thanks to the organizing committee for their tireless dedication, and to all who supported us directly or indirectly in bringing ICDE to life. We trust that the conversation sparked here will continue to inspire meaningful research, transformative teaching practices, and enduring collaborations across South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Aarti. Before we disperse, the organizing committee has few announcements. The first technical session starts at 11 a.m. as we planned. Please proceed to your respective venues. The lunch and evening refreshments will be served in the old management block. Thank you all for your cooperation in making this inaugural session a success despite the heavy rain in the morning. We wish you all a fruitful and inspiring conference experience. Thank you all.